Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier is an extraordinary piece of music, filled with depth and delight, and a searching, a yearning. It seeks to outline the architecture of the universe, to find the harmony that underlies it all. It was enabled by a new technology, both a hardware system and a software system. The hardware system was the clavier, a new instrument that was part of the evolution of instruments from the harpsichord to the piano. The software system was called temperament, and it was a new way of tuning instruments, but it was also unleashed a whole new way of thinking. The tuning of instruments actually reaches back to Pythagoras, 2,100 years before. Pythagoras had observed that there was a ratio between the proportions of the distances of notes on a lyre, and that he projected that that same ratio was the ratio between the proportion of the distances of the planets. And in fact, he saw this ratio unfolding in many aspects of the universe. He called it the golden ratio. And he came up with a theory that that was the organizing harmony of the universe. It was an interesting idea, and it was an important idea, but it was incorrect, because in fact the universe unfolds through fitness. It unfolds through the coevolution of its parts, and not through absolute rules. This theory actually was discovered by his wife, Theano, the beautiful woman who's looking away from him as he is lecturing. She came up with a theory called the golden mean, and she said, in fact, that although we intellectually rationalize and create extremes, that the universe is always actually moving towards the middle, towards the in-between, and that is where generation, generativeness, and fruitfulness takes place. So how does this apply to cities? So what happened was that what came out of Theano's thinking in 1689 was taken by Andreas Werkmeister, and he transformed it into a new kind of tuning system called well-temperament. And the well-tempered system tuned each note not to the Pythagorean perfection, but to a place in between. The problem with the Pythagorean perfection was that each key could only function independently. You couldn't switch from key to key. As a matter of fact, if you tried, what you came upon was something they called a wolf tone. It was an excruciating disharmony. By tuning each key imperfectly, each note imperfectly, but so that the keys could work together, we created this ultimate harmony that allowed Bach to write the well-tempered system. And this, in fact, as we look towards the evolution of our cities today, is the kind of thinking that I think we need to help us deal with the issues of the 21st century. And what are those issues? In the 21st century, the population of the world is growing enormously. By 2050, we will be 10 billion people. And by the end of the century, 80% of us will live in cities. This enormous pressure that is being put on cities is straining them. We're seeing growth, and growth is unequal. So for example, in China, in the next 30 years, 250 million people will move to cities, whereas cities like Detroit are emptying out. Over the last few decades, they have lost a population of 1 million people. This pathway of inequality is also being manifested in income. We're seeing cities becoming more and more bisected by extreme wealth and extreme poverty that are not integrating, that are not living together. There are other divides in our cities too. We're seeing racial divides that are beginning to rack them. And we're seeing divides of faith. For example, we're seeing the distances between Hindu and Muslim, between Shiite and Sunni. At the same time, the population that is growing is also becoming wealthier and is consuming more. We're moving from being citizens to being consumers. And as this is happening, we're consuming enormous resources from the earth, putting great stress on the environment. And so, for example, our rainforests are being clear-cut to provide pulp and paper for paper. Our oceans are being overfished to provide protein. Our soils are being depleted. And our air is being terribly polluted as we burn fossil fuel energy to be able to empower our cities. This is not only causing enormous pollution, which is causing problems of health to humans, but is also causing health to the entire climate system and to the environment. And as that happens, we're seeing the effects of sea level rising. We're seeing heat increase in cities, but also what we're seeing around the world is drought. And as drought increases, it is driving more and more people from the countryside to the city. Drought has a more devastating effect. If you look at the course of the history of cities, what you see is that whenever you have this confluence of inequality, of racial disparities, of growing population, and of drought and climate change, you get collapse. Collapses happen many, many times throughout the course of civilization, and we're beginning to see it happen now. And we're seeing it particularly in the Middle East, the very birthplace of civilization. This happens to be in Syria, in Palmyra, Syria, one of the great historic cities of our time, falling apart into disarray. So how do we deal with this toxic mix of growing population, of income disparity, of racial differences, and climate change? The answer is we need to temper it. And I believe that there is a system of temperament that can aid our cities, because cities, as I mentioned, are the places where most of us will live. The temperament begins just as the temperament of the musical system began with a confluence of hardware and software. So we need to do the same with our cities. We need to temper our hardware to turn them from linear systems into cyclical systems. So for example, take a water system. In our cities, we normally gather our water in reservoirs, we take it through our cities, we use it, we pollute it, and it comes out as waste. Imagine instead if we rethought of this system, the use of water, not as a linear pathway, but as a cyclical pathway. We can actually cycle all the major infrastructure of our cities. We could take our energy systems and cycle the heat to turn it back into energy. We can take our waste, our organic waste, and just as the city of San Francisco does, collect them and recycle them back as compost and use that to enrich the soils that feed the city. We can take construction waste and demolition and materials, recycle them and return them into new construction materials. And by doing so, we reduce, as our population grows, we reduce the pressure on the Earth's resources. This actually first took place in Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia. Namibia is in southern Africa. It's actually where human beings first emerged from nature. What we saw in Windhoek is it was a city whose population was also dramatically growing, and it's a city who was encountering increasing drought. This was unsustainable. And so what they did is they invented a system in which they're able to take their wastewater and clean it to perfection and recycle it and bring it back in as an input into drinking water. As a result, Windhoek today is thriving. It is 3 times the population that it had been before. We also need to take this cycling of communities, this cycling of infrastructure systems, and apply it to the software systems, apply it to the human cultural systems of our cities. So this is a model of what a neighborhood might be like. These are the components that make for healthy neighborhoods. They need affordable housing, they need superb education, they need health care, open space, neighborhood serving markets, arts and culture, access to transit, livelihood and jobs. These are called communities of opportunities. We weave the fabric of our neighborhoods with all of these elements. We create cauldrons. We create places in which families and individuals can prosper and thrive. But if we map our neighborhoods today in most of our cities, what we see is that they are out of balance. Now what's interesting is that we have new software systems. We have big data. We can actually sense what is going on. We can take data from healthcare systems, we can take educational performance, we can look at affordable housing gaps, and we can tune our cities. We can begin to use the tools of governance, of the way we invest, the way we run programs, and we can integrate those all to create neighborhoods of opportunity. And by mapping the performance of them, we can continually evolve them towards better and better wholeness. And that is ultimately what we seek. What we seek in our cities is just the same as what we seek in ourselves, which is coherence and wholeness. This is the Lafitte Housing Project. It's in New Orleans. It was built in 1946 to house the poor. New Orleans was then a thriving city, but over the following decades, it began to decline. By the time Hurricane Katrina hit, New Orleans had one of the worst public school systems, one of the worst healthcare systems. The public housing system was so bad, it was taken over by the federal government. The flood came. The flood was devastating. The mayor said that actually it was a near-death experience for the city. And afterwards, the city had to decide how was it going to rebuild itself. And after much thought and much discussion, it chose to rebuild itself differently than it had been in the past. This is the Lafitte Housing Project today. It's a mixed-use, mixed-income project. The buildings, which were old and inefficient, are not only handicapped accessible and new, but they're much greener, they're much more friendly for the environment. But more importantly, these buildings are now nested in an entirely new neighborhood of opportunity. Healthcare system used to be provided by one hospital called Charity Hospital, which was a horrible place to take your children. Today, it's been replaced by a distributed system of 88 neighborhood centers, one near the Lafitte project. And the families in Lafitte are actually being trained to be home health care aides and to work in dialysis centers, et cetera, so that it's not only providing them health care, it's also a place for jobs. There's a new Whole Foods that's providing healthy food, but also providing jobs. There's a much better school. There's pre-K, child care systems. There's neighborhood community centers. There's an art center. There's a beautiful new greenway. All these elements that make for healthy neighborhoods are being woven into the fabric of the new New Orleans. This is a photo of Hurricane Sandy. Sandy was followed by the destruction of Joplin in Missouri, was followed by the destruction of Port-au-Prince in Haiti, it's been followed by the destruction of Kathmandu, and so on throughout the world. And the key question that we have to face is, must we wait for disaster before we have the will to rebuild our cities? Or can we create a new narrative in which we can imagine what the future of the city should be and have the courage and make the commitment to begin to do that now? To do so, we need to build what we call well-tempered cities. They take the lessons from Bach, which was not only to create a new operating system that marries with a new technology, a new hardware system, and an operating system based on interdependence, a system that opens up the possibility to integrate all aspects of the city. The new operating system needs to be combined with a new way of thinking, a new way of approach. We need to do three things. The first is we need to move towards coherence. Coherence is a coherence of vision. It is the base from which we work. It is the aspiration towards which we move. The second is connectivity. Without connectivity, we cannot create coherence. And the third is compassion. It is only when we entwine the vision of the city with compassion and love for all, with the desire to relieve the suffering of every single element within it. It is only that entwinement of an understanding of the vast, extraordinary interdependence of all of its elements and the compassion to heal them that we can create a well-tempered city. And to remind us that a human being can do such a thing, we listen to Bach. Good voices.